All right. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend. I don't know. I can't remember exactly how long. Maybe 2012. I don't know how long ago it goes back, but Katelin and I have been friends for quite some time now. We initially met through a bloggers network. Katelin was running this really powerful website called By Their Strange Fruit, engaging anti-racism and Christianity for a very long time, kind of behind the scenes. And so that was our first introduction and connection. And we had some other stuff here and there. I had the privilege once of being in Columbus and connecting with her over in her city. But when I was thinking about the opportunity to bring folks in to share with our community, I was thinking about her church and her nonprofit and just the ways that they're on a similar kind of journey as our own church is. And so I thought that there could be just some mutual learnings that we could have from her. So Katelin, now I got to remember, I was just thinking about the fact she has a PhD, but it's not in theology or ministry or any of those things. Is it like neuroscience? Is that what it was,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So she's very, very smart, and yet a sense of calling that even after completing all that hard work, decided to put all her efforts towards the church and the nonprofit. And so it's a really cool. But Caitlin is the operations director for the nonprofit for Church for All People at her church and nonprofit, and then also the minister of music at her church as well. And so she's doing that work for quite a while. And so I'm just excited, especially she already had a great word for us, but especially for this time, I think just the opportunity to learn more and to hear more and to dialogue with her as we're on our own journey and kind of continuing to grow and to seek God's shalom for us. So anyway, let's just welcome Katelin into this space, and it's your floor.
Oh, thanks so much, Drew, and thank you, Pastor Josiah, for having me. Just a delight to be with you all, if not physically there in Harrisburg, digitally. Um, and really enjoyed your all's worship service this morning. The music beautiful, and loved the children's moment. So very on point. Probably didn't have a chance to, we didn't have a chance to connect notes, but it was like right on point. I love it. And yeah, just grateful for the opportunity and grateful for your friendship and accompaniment low these years, Drew. I think we worked together on a variety of Men and Nerds projects, and it wasn't until you were talking that I remembered one video session that we did like as a panel together, and I took that call from the laboratory because I would sneak doing ministry work while I was still in the lab. And finished, defended the dissertation and did all of that, but ultimately ended up working for the church. And there's never been a better time to be in ministry. So grateful for the opportunity this day and every day to be with you all. If you all had some chance to join in on this morning's worship service, you've got some context and background for who I am and who we are at Church for All People in Columbus. My hope for our time this afternoon is to share a little bit with you all, maybe visually, so you can see some video and images, but then also to have some conversation. As I've been talking to Drew and Pastor Josiah, it just sounds like our two churches are so like-minded and so very much on a similar journey with each other. And so I'm grateful to be in that with you and in that ministry together. And so maybe there's some learnings that we have for each other. And if there's a Wesleyan phrase, if your heart be like my heart, let us join hands. And we'll do the work together. So maybe by way of sort of final introduction, Pastor, if you'd be willing to show video, it features our executive director and founding pastor, who will sort of give an overview of this notion of the divine economy of abundance, asset-based community development, and then also sort of give you a visual of our church and our community.
They're grounded in the concept of asset-based community development. The concept's really simple. We look to see the assets, the resources that are in our own community, and then we begin to try to dream God's dream of what we could do to improve quality of life. Yes, it's about welcoming people into our congregation. It's also listening to people as they dream their dreams of wanting a better place to live, a job that pays a living wage, people who want to be healthy and want to see their kids prosper and thrive in school. And asset-based community development says we can do any and all those things if we just draw upon the partnerships, the resources, the gifts that are right here. And as we have impact in a small area of ministry, it draws new partners, and ultimately we can transform the quality of life of the whole community into something that's beautiful and helps us to know we live inside a divine economy of abundance. We're standing in front of the Ministry Center for the United Methodist Church for All People. This ministry center includes a primary care medical home. It's part of a partnership we do with a Roman Catholic hospital system that provides medical care to people on a sliding scale. Across the street is an abandoned drive-through liquor store that we're about to turn into doubling of the space for our fresh market that provides fruits and vegetables to hundreds of families each week. We run a bicycle shop, all kinds of things that help to improve quality of life. But it's all grounded in a faith community that's inclusive and welcomes everybody in this amazingly diverse community. Now, all the ministries of the United Methodist Church for All People find their origin in what's known as the United Methodist Free Store. The Free Store was launched in January of 1999. It was originally a ministry of the Columbus South District of the United Methodist Church. And we had a real simple idea. We invited people to donate gently used clothing and household items. And we then rented a storefront in an inner city neighborhood on the south side of Columbus. And we invited the folks who had gathered up the materials to follow their donations into this inner city neighborhood and to then volunteer and get to build relationships of mutuality with the people who came to shop. And so we gradually moved into an awareness of what we now call a divine economy of abundance. God made everything in creation. God made it good, and God made it abundant. And if we take what we have, no matter how meager it seems to us, God will multiply that for God's purposes. So for us, it was this incredible aha experience of coming to an awareness that in this free store, we had stepped inside of the divine economy of abundance. And then we began to listen and respond to the hopes and dreams of the people all around us. We are committed to concepts called asset-based community development. It's the idea that if we want to do ministry, we should stop focusing on needs and deficiencies and what's broken, and instead turn and focus on what are people's dreams and what are the resources and assets that we already have inside this divine economy of abundance. We had folks struggling with slum landlords, people who just wanted a decent place to live. And then we also had people who were dreaming of going back to work and being able to earn an income for their families. And so we decided to see these things as opportunities. We had all kinds of boarded up, vacant, blighted houses in our community. And we said those are assets, not liabilities, in the sense that we ought to be able to figure out how to take one of those houses, take people from the neighborhood who wanted to go to work, put them together, and then create a really good place for a family to live. Somebody approached me and said they actually owned a duplex that was vacant and blighted, and he turned it over to us, and we went to work. And we moved in 2 families, and it was the beginning of this journey. And now, 12 years later, starting from that one duplex, we've done $50 million worth of affordable housing in this community. Look around in this neighborhood, and it's so clear. We live inside a divine economy of abundance. It's the same model in everything we're about. Welcome to the residences at Career Gateway. This is a $12 million apartment complex under construction that also has job training space. Now, Church for All People isn't a rich church, but through partnerships, we have been able to bring this project to life. It's partnerships in the state of Ohio and Nationwide Children's Hospital that's not only helping to build these units, but is promising to train people who live here and in the surrounding community so they can get entry-level jobs at the hospital. It's the biggest challenge in any kind of job training to know if there's really a job at the end of the training process. And we're standing in a space that guarantees success. People who move in here will be able to be in a 10-minute walk of the hospital where their new job will be. The training will happen right here where they're living. And others from the neighborhood who weren't able to move into these beautiful apartments can still move into the job training experiences and have a chance at a better life. It's amazing what can happen in the divine economy of abundance. Give what you have and then invite partners, and it will multiply. Partners who have ties to a community that's dreaming of a better quality of life.
Thanks, Pastor, for your help with that. I think I'm going to share my screen just as I go. There might be some pictures that are useful to us. And you all can do what you'd like, but sometimes it's helpful for me if I do that side-by-side mode so that I can see both the PowerPoint and the whole group of us, so that hopefully we'll have a chance to have a little bit of conversation as well. I'll do just some brief overview. You've now heard a couple of times this notion of the divine economy of abundance. But the reason we emphasize it so much is we've just seen it happen too many times not to believe it. We take that scripture of John 6 loaves and fishes incredibly literally, because so many times there's been not enough soup that feeds too many people. There's been someone looking for a bookcase in the free store that, well, you haven't had a bookcase in weeks or months, and then one appears. Or there's a classic story of a guy not long ago who was getting fined for the city because he was in violation of code, and he had all these holes in his yard, and he was coming in looking for dirt, and he wanted to know if we had dirt in the free store. Well, we never have dirt, but of course, not 20 minutes later, someone came in and said, well, I've just finished, planting a whole new garden bed, and I way overbought on soil, and can you all use this? And typically we would say, no, we don't want your extra mud and dirt. But we've just seen it happen too many times not to take it incredibly literally in our space. And it really does stem from the free store. I touched on this already this morning, but if you come and visit us, and we welcome you to, you'll see that, it's on some levels a normal thrift shop, although everything's for free. But the back sorting room is piled high, floor to ceiling, with stuff. The challenge is how to keep up with the volume of stuff. And the more volunteers we have, the more we can get out on the shelves and give more away. But we've never run out of good things to give to our community. In fact, the challenge is not getting buried under all the stuff. We took yesterday and Friday and Saturday off for Juneteenth, and even this Sunday morning, the donations keep rolling in, and so we'll have to play catch up with all the volume of God's grace that comes in at any given time. And so I won't dwell on the notion of loaves and fishes, except to say that we believe God is still performing this miracle over and over and over again, and we've seen it come alive before our very eyes. There is this sort of secular sociological corollary to what we in our theological language call the divine economy of abundance, but it's asset-based community development. This comes out of Northwestern University, John Kretzmann and John McKnight, sort of the classic leaders of asset-based community development. And what they contend is there's sort of these two ways of looking at the world. There's a needs-based approach that looks at what's broken and what's missing, and then sort of creates services and programs to fit those needs. And then people are the consumers and the programs are the answers to problems. Instead, what they suggest is if we look at the assets of our community, what we already have, and insist that what we have is enough, more than enough, then in our language, God multiplies it to do great things. And it's our connections and the things that we bring that are the answers, and the people themselves become the answers. And so too often in grants or public funding, there's sort of right at the top a needs statement, and you talk about the needs of your community, and it almost becomes like a race to the bottom. Whoever can denigrate their own community the most is the one that gets the money. And we just refuse to play that game. There's already too many voices telling us what's broken, what's wrong, what's missing in our neighborhood. And we'd much rather talk about what we have and the opportunities that are there. And so on some level, it may just be rhetoric. Is the glass half empty? Is the glass half full? We would contend it doesn't really matter how big the cup is. If you focus on the water, you could have the same amount of water in a small cup or a big cup. It's the water that's important, not how much might be missing. If you're thirsty, you will drink. And so on some level, it is rhetoric, but there's also an energy and a momentum to an asset-based approach that's simply not there from a needs and deficits-based approach. And so we will get well-meaning community partners that want to come into our neighborhood and do a needs assessment. And it looks something like what you see on the screen. It's, seeing that we've got unemployment and homelessness and dropout and poverty and all these things. But it's just such a downer. And so we like the partnership, we like to collaborate, but we'll invite an asset map instead. Tell us what we have. And our community is really quite rich. We have businesses and hospitals, and we have young folks and old folks and artists and schools and churches. So there's a lot going on. And if we start with what we already have, no matter how meager it seems to us, if we offer it forward to God like that little boy's lunch, God multiplies it into amazing things. And so this slide just simply talks about comparing those two frameworks side by side. And I include it just to note that the side on the left just saps the energy out of the room. It tells us everything that's wrong with us. And it can be the very same community that has all the things on the right that do have a sort of energy and momentum to them. And so we just insist in these sort of core truths that there is a divine economy of abundance, that in Genesis there's an abundance, in Revelation there's an abundance, and when we are generous with one another, we trigger a return to the abundance that God originally intended, and we're surrounded by assets. Our number one asset will be God's people and the gift of the Holy Spirit moving through those people, and then it grows from there. We also talk a lot about starting small. It doesn't mean that you start with very big first steps. The dream is big, but the start is small. You start with one loaf and one fish, and you break them and you share them. And before you know it, you've got 12 baskets at the end of the day. And then the final sort of core corollary to this, if you please, is if you start small and get that early win, if you share that loaf with one person, that's a win for that person. And then they're more likely to come alongside in partnership for whatever you're apt to do next. So I've got a couple of examples of this, and then I can turn it over and we can have some conversation about it. And jump over that just to say, this is sort of the broad overview of the various programs and ministries we have. every single one of them is grounded in this notion of a divine economy of abundance. And we pair that with the other core concept that I spoke more about this morning, this notion that I'm sure you all are familiar with, just authentic relationships of mutuality and accompaniment across typical cultural divides. And it's out of that authenticity that we have the trust and relationship to discover each other's hopes, dreams, and aspirations that lead to whatever God might be up to next. And so John in the video referenced our housing work, and I will confess to you that video is a couple years old now. The Residence of the Career Gateway is completed, the Fresh Market's completed. I've got pictures of those for you later. He says in the video, the video was done in 2018, so not that long ago. He says it was $50 million in affordable housing. It's now $100 million in affordable housing. And we've actually identified where the next 50 million will come from in the next year or so. So we've come a long way, but we started very small. The dream is big, the start is small. And what you see here is the very first house we renovated in 2005. On the left is the before. And it really did stem from a sermon that Pastor John gave. At the time, he was the pastor of the church, as well as the executive director for the nonprofit. Now he's the executive director solely. We've got a different pastor at the church. And in fact, he's getting ready to retire even from the nonprofit side. But at the time, he did both. And he preached a sermon, not unlike what I've described to you about a divine economy of abundance. And what if everything God gives us is an asset, not a deficit? As I mentioned this morning, what if an empty house is a place someone could live? What if the unemployment is a workforce that can be put to work fixing up the house? And then if you put the time and money into the house, the homelessness is absolutely an asset because you have to have someone living in the house. And so he preached along those lines. And we sometimes have guest churches come and serve breakfast to us. And so we have guests in our worship service. And so someone came up to him afterwards, not a member of the congregation, but one of these guests, and essentially said to him, "Pastor, did you mean what you preached?" And he's an honest man. So he said, "Well, this time, sometimes we preach faith until we have faith." And the guy said, "If you're serious, I own this house, the one that's pictured here. And I want to maintain ownership, but I'll lease it to you for, $10 a year or whatever. And I'll give you the money to fix it up. Just like you said, hire folks in the neighborhood." And so we put out the call for people to come and fix up this house. And we do worship a good and gracious God. And so every single person that showed up, answered the call to work on this house, was expert plumbers and carpenters and electricians in their own imaginations. It turns out by finished carpenter, they really just meant like, I finished the job afterwards by sweeping up the sawdust. Or by roofer, they really just meant, well, I helped carry the shingles from point A to point B. So we were really bad at it. We made lots of mistakes along the way. There's the old adage that goes, you're supposed to measure twice and cut once. For us, it was kind of like, if you cut enough pieces of drywall, something will fit. To this day, those walls are a little bit wibbly wobbly. We just didn't know what we were doing. And at one point, the whole project sort of culminated when John got a call from the city code inspectors. Turns out they were on the front porch and they were shutting the whole thing down. And so John walked over there and came up with this idea. He started explaining to the city code officer the notion of separation of church and state. You guys are like the government, and you've got your rules, but we're the church, so we're just trying to do good things, and it doesn't really matter if we pulled a permit or we are, doing this to code. And for his trouble, he got a big red sticker that pasted on the door, and we got shut down. And so I say all this to say, we've done 100 million in housing, but we started very humbly and we made a lot of mistakes. but we celebrated the wins along the way. And so we did finish that first house. You see the final product on the right. And we had a big ribbon cutting. Another pastor of ours, Pastor Donita, used to say, we were kindergarten happy, and we invited the news media, and kids, cut the ribbon and all that stuff. And we got one news outlet to come out, and we were that sort of feel good outro at the tail end of the 11 o'clock news. But we were there. And the next day, John got a call in the office from sort of one of these big kid developers, a nonprofit developer, saying essentially, Pastor, did you mean what you said on the TV? And he said, essentially, this time. And so they came alongside us, and off we went. And honestly, I can't even regale you with all the mistakes we've made. We bought up our first 14 homes during the peak of the housing boom in 2008 and 2009. And we were sitting on the liability to all that property when the housing market came out from under us. We knew we had $1.49 in the bank. We just didn't know if it was in the red or the black. And so I'd be happy to tell you how terrible we were at this for quite some time. But I do want to emphasize that we persisted. We took the early wins and house by house, block by block, transformed our community from blight into a very visual representation of God's light and God's grace. We leveraged each of these wins into subsequent housing developments. This is Parsons Village 1. It's now the first of two senior housing complexes for folks 55 and better that are below certain incomes. This is the Residences at Career Gateway that John referenced in the video. It's 58 units of housing along with on-site job training space for folks to learn to get a job. And so you couple the notion of affordable housing with increased wages, increased earning potential, so that people can pay their rent if that's what they want to do. We've got opportunities for first-time home ownership if that's what they want to do, but increasing wages and job opportunities for folks coupled with the housing work. In our community, probably not unlike parts of your area, certainly across the country, gentrification is a serious issue. And so about 10 to 15 years ago now, as we were doing the work in housing, we wanted to make sure that we didn't become the victims of our own success. And although we started in first-time home ownership, we now almost exclusively focus in rental. There are still ways to become a first-time homeowner, but we want to ensure that there are plenty of affordable rental opportunities. And we partner very closely with an entity called the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. And they're sort of the think tank, the academic think tank that helps us know the right price points to sell houses, what's the right rental price points, what's the right mix of single family and mixed income, multi-unit housing, so that we can maintain an opportunity-rich mixed income community that neither tips into blight and vacancy nor into gentrification and displacement. And I'll be really honest, we don't know if we'll be successful. Cities across the country have seen these very strong market forces that lead to displacement. We are hopeful, given the data that the Kirwan Institute has around housing. They say if you can control 25% of the housing stock, and maintain that as affordable housing, then even if pockets of the neighborhood gentrify, or a house here, a house there, you're sort of holding down the middle so that there is not a tipping point, but rather a broader plateau. So we'll see. At this point, there are census tracts where we or our partners control 25% of the housing stock, and that's all rental property. And so we're hopeful, but those market forces are indeed incredibly strong. it's important for us that we continue to serve in lots of different ways. And so the fresh market is another one that John mentioned. This is our original fresh market that served about 200 people a week and did really good work and was beautiful community. The struggle we had with it was small and we could only fit so many people through at a given time, and it was only open a couple of days a week. And we get the donations for our food from the Mid-Ohio Food Collective for free, and they deliver it for free, but they've got a forklift that comes and delivers the produce, but then couldn't fit through the front door of our little storefront market. And so we had volunteers schlepping tens of thousands of pounds through the front doors, whether it was raining or snowing or whatever. And then meantime, across the street, as John referenced in the video, we had this vacant, blighted drive-through beer store, which we would contend was not a great help to the community. And yet, in a divine economy of abundance, everything is an asset. And so this drive-through beer store, it turns out, is perfect for giving away fruits and vegetables. First of all, you can see on the left that there was refrigeration that used to hold the beer and the liquor that could now keep fruits and vegetables fresh and could help us take double, even triple the amounts of produce that we were before and give even more away. And so now we see about 350 people every single day, and we've given away 3.5 million pounds of produce every year. That definitely increased during COVID, although now it's stabilized a little bit more. The other great thing about a drive-through beer store is it has a garage door. And so the forklift could come drive right on through. And we still have to have volunteers to stock the shelves like any good grocery store might, but they can do it under the cover of the drive-through. And so here's what it looks like today. You see on the right the refrigeration that used to have all of the beer and other unhealthy foods now has eggs and fruits and vegetables. And it's been important to us that we create a welcoming community, what we've come to know as third place. And I'll circle back to that in a little bit, but it was really intentional that there be a hangout space to just come and enjoy each other on the front porch, if you will, of the beer, of what used to be a beer store, now into a fresh market. And so I want to give maybe one final example of this divine economy of abundance, and as we've seen it play out in really practical ways. In our community, it's still true today, but it was much worse several years ago. We had really serious, and still do, issues of infant mortality in our community. Babies dying too young, being born too small, too soon. And this is a situation that is particularly influenced by what are called the social determinants of health. So whether you have access to a stable house or a job or transportation, all really affected babies' outcomes. Moreover, because these are the social determinants of health, they're highly influenced by social factors, in particular class, and even more so race. One of the most dangerous things for a baby in utero is stress in the womb. And so if you're moving from house to house, if you don't have transportation, that's very stressful on the pregnant parent, and that gets transferred to the child. And there is very few things that are more stressful than the constant daily effects of racism. And that has a literal effect on babies' outcomes as they try to be born full term, full weight, and survive to their first birthdays. And so communities like ours across the country that see disparities on race and class had disproportionate outcomes for babies trying to thrive. And this has been happening for decades, even centuries. But, Columbus is brilliant, so they just now woke up to that. And they decided to do what any good government task force would do, and they formed a committee to deal with it. And to be honest, they were wringing their hands and not getting a lot of traction. And these are our friends and partners. I'm not speaking out of school. They knew it. But we had another deaconess on our staff at the time whose background was in healthcare. And she was listening to these meetings and seeing they weren't getting anywhere because they were so deficit based. And so she came and just helped us brainstorm, what do we want to do? What can we do as a small church to help babies thrive? And so the first thing we started to think about is what's the asset-based approach? Because we feel there's a greater energy and momentum and God's blessing in that. And so one of the notions of an asset-based approach is focusing on not what's broken and what's missing, but the hope, dream, and aspiration. What's the goal? And so the definition of infant mortality is a baby dying before it reaches day 366, before it reaches its first birthday. So the goal became really clear. We're helping babies get to their first birthdays. And so we decided to just celebrate those 1-year-olds that made it. And we started hosting first birthday parties with cake and balloons and music and gifts, everything that a birthday party should have. And it was a community resource fair. So there was information on safe sleep for babies. Babies should be alone on their back in the crib. Information about smoking cessation. Information about accessing managed care providers and how to get to an OBGYN. By the way, until very recently, there was no private practice OBGYN in our neighborhood and very limited public services. And so we started hosting these parties. The point is this: we packed our church building out with 200 to 300 people in a way that would never happen if we had sort of a community meeting on infant mortality. You'd get like 5 people to show up and none of them would actually have kids, but there's an energy and a momentum from an asset-based approach. So there was sort of a collective buy-in from the community with that sort of notion. And we're not stupid. We invited our partners, Nationwide Children's Hospital, who'd been working with us on housing and other initiatives across time. And they saw that we had trust and relationship with the community and the word was getting out. And they sort of understand that a doctor in a white coat can say, you shouldn't smoke around our pregnant people, and you should stop doing this and that. But they know that if someone on their front porch, auntie on the corner says, not on my block, will you smoke around my pregnant grandchild? Then all of a sudden there's a community buy-in and a momentum that they're really not able to achieve on their own. They also know that they have great resources, great research, great data, and they want to disseminate that to the community, but they don't have the trust of the community to listen back. So, for example, that same doctor in a white coat can tell us, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. And we say, thank you, that's great. We've got a fresh market. We'll deliver apples to the community. But what if you don't have teeth? That gets tough with that apple. Can we make applesauce and maybe modify these resources so that there's a better access for our community? And so Children's Hospital is a great partner. And they saw what we were doing with the first birthdays. The first one was, like I said, you start small with what you have, no matter how meager it seems to you. We had handmade decorations, very scrappy, just sort of doing what we could. And Children's Hospital, Nationwide Children's Hospital, came alongside and said, we want to fund these first birthdays. And so we now do them quarterly. And they said, we want to pay for a full-time staff person to follow up on those first birthday parties. And we had a church partner that was willing to give us diapers to give out to our community. And so it turns out if you knock on the front door of someone who has a newborn with an armful of diapers, the door opens with a quickness and you can start to have conversations about, is baby getting their well child checkups? Have the parents gotten the care that they need? Are vaccinations happening? And so the program grew from there. And as I mentioned, infant vitality is highly affected by the social determinants of health, and no one more so than housing, stable housing. Housing as a vaccine is sort of the catchphrase. And so we had this infant vitality program through first birthdays. We had housing, and we thought we'd try to put them together. And so through a partnership with a managed care provider named CareSource, we housed 10 pregnant parents through the first birthdays of their child. And every single one of those kids were born full term. They all survived to their first birthday, when statistically we wouldn't have expected that otherwise. And so then the city of Columbus took over that program, turned it into a multi-million-dollar initiative. We don't run it. We don't want to. It's too big for us. But the point is this: just like the community had increased momentum and buy-in, our partners were willing to have us try something out, take a risk. And when we were willing to give the win to them afterwards, there was an energy and momentum that was there that wouldn't necessarily have been there from an asset-based approach. When, if we had gone to the city and said, you should invest millions and millions of dollars in housing, pregnant parents, or if we'd gone to Nationwide Children's and said, babies are dying in your backyard and we are righteously and justifiably angry, but you should pay us to do these birthday parties. You should fund us to have a full-time staff person. Their public relations chief, Angela Mingo, would have sort of tapped us on our head and sent us on our way. And so I say all these things just to emphasize the notion that it is a divine economy of abundance. God will take what we have and will multiply it. And if we start small, if we start with that first loaf and we start with that first fish and offer it forward, when we're generous with one another, we really do trigger a return to the abundance that God originally intended for each one of us. And so there are countless examples. We try to use this strategy in building what we call third places, which kind of loops back to the other notion for us of building authentic relationships. As I mentioned, our Fresh Market is designed to draw folks together across race and across class. So it's the sort of pairing between those two notions, a divine economy of abundance with authentic relationships that build bridging social capital so that the resources and the economics can flow freely between groups instead of staying cloistered with one group. And we've really found that God will multiply it to do great things in our community, much larger than we could have ever hoped or dreamed or imagined. And we end up with 12 baskets left over when we really only thought we had one little boy's lunch. So I'm going to pause there. I'd love to hear some of your examples of what you've seen. I've got on the screen a couple of different resources just on this specific concept. The first one is Building Communities from the Inside Out by John Kretzmann and John McKnight. That's sort of the big green Bible of asset-based community development. And then Luther Snow wrote a corollary to that on the power of asset mapping, which really contextualizes asset-based community development in a church context. So I wanted to just leave you with those, but I'd love to just hear from you all. Where have you seen the divine economy of abundance in your own ministry settings? Where have you seen a strategy of asset-based ministry play itself out? And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you all better. There we go.
I think an easy one for us and on Hummel Street in Harrisburg is something called Brethren Housing Association. Our church was involved in starting what that has become. And essentially, years ago, we had a parsonage connected to our church that was no longer needed to be a parsonage because our pastors lived elsewhere. And the idea that we have this space and we also have people to live in this space, a lot of single moms in our neighborhood, and then a whole, slew of churches. I think it started with maybe 4 or 5 churches with willing workers wanting to know how to get involved and how to help people. And you put all those things together, and what is it, 30 years later now, something like that.
Something like that.
Maybe longer. We have our entire block. It's no longer like underneath our church at all, but our entire block has more or less been bought, flipped, and now houses single moms through an up to 2-year program, where there are also needs of like career readiness and resume writing and budgeting and all these different things are a part of it. But it started like it's similar to your story. It started very small with one property, and now, I mean, they have a multi-million-dollar budget every year for all the different things that God's doing through that organization. And we still provide them with very, very, very affordable office space in our building, and we do a lot of partnering together. And our church remains one of the big, church donors, I would say, of the organization. But it's amazing to see how that dream, a couple decades ago has now just changed our entire block. So that's a good example.
Yeah, and your story about starting small and making lots of mistakes sounds very familiar. I thought when we started that a couple pastors, a couple hours a week would be able to counsel the families and help work with them, and that was pretty naive. And we learned as we went, and the Lord blessed it, and to what Josiah said about it today.
Yeah, it's sort of.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to mention most of our programs that are success stories happened the same way, starting small, planting a small twig and it growing into computer classes, into programs for youth. But each of those started small, and a lot of other things were started that didn't grow. But you try, and some are blessed, and some serve for a short time, and some become large trees.
Yeah, and it's never wrong to prune when something's not bearing fruit.
Right.
Our original Fresh Market was done in the back of our church, and frankly, it was awful. We would bag groceries and just shove them at people. There was a long line, and everyone was grumpy. And so we shut it down and we stopped doing it. Mm-hmm. And we gave it time to rethink it and how it might be better. And that's the iteration, the first iteration of the Fresh Market that I showed you pictures of, was actually our second attempt that was a much more peaceable kingdom of folks shopping and selecting what they wanted. But it's messy. It doesn't always go smoothly. In fact, it almost never does.
Right.
But when we leverage those early wins, get the win early on, and then offer that to our partners, it does grow.
Yeah, I find you need to keep re-envisioning what the Lord's calling you to do in the community, and not just get into maintaining what you've always done.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Juanita can talk about the community garden.
Well, we actually have people from the community this year taking care of all the little boxes that we have, the raised beds that we have. And hopefully they'll do well, and it will help the people from the community to grow some fresh vegetables of their own. this is the first year that we've had somebody take all of the beds and adopt them.
That's neat. It's neat. And I only just alluded to the notion of third place, but is that a concept that you all have? It's never clear to me how popular that notion is of third place.
Yeah.
It's
We
this
want to be first or second. We don't want third place. Joking.
Yeah, it's this concept that comes from Ray Oldenburg. And first place is where you live, second place is where you work or go to school, third place is where you hang out when you're not at work or school. And true third place is very equitable in that anyone can show up. You don't have to have a certain membership. You don't have to dress a certain way. And true third place is bringing folks together across cultural divides. One, for conversation and building relationship, but ultimately for equity of resources. And this is an idea that's been around, but it actually came to us again from the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, because they sort of told us, well, that's what we were doing in our church. And it looks a lot like what you all are doing in your church. We just called it like the inclusive body of Christ, or just, church for all people. And true third place can be tricky because, birds of a feather want to flock together. And in many ways, churches have been founded on that you bring people that are similar together, and then you can grow churches very quickly by doing that. But we're not birds. We weren't created to be. And so that sort of bonding social capital, which is the social capital we have with folks that are like us, is a little bit easier to generate because by definition, you have things in common. And it's important. Bonding social capital is what you have with your own family. It's what you have, cultural and ethnic groups build bonding social capital, and particularly in a diaspora, when you have that opportunity to come together and have that bonding social capital to help one another, it's incredibly essential. So that's why we see things like Black student unions in predominantly white institutions. They're essential. And at the same time, if particularly dominant cultures stay within their own, then those resources will never travel outside of those groups. And so in addition to bonding social capital, we want to build bridging social capital, which is that social capital that can transfer resources across groups. And so the strategy is you build these third places to generate bridging social capital, but then you sort of have to have a focus that isn't your ethnicity, or it isn't your family heritage, or it isn't your love of golfing or whatever, that it's some other thing. And so in the church, it's often the worship and love of Jesus Christ that we're using to bring folks together. But we also became really intentional about creating those spaces all around our community. We have a bike shop that was intentionally founded to be third place. We noticed that the free store was third place sort of naturally. People do really like to shop, and they like to shop for free. And so we were building those relationships across race and across class. And so we became curious, how do we create that? And so can we bring together people that all like bikes, whether they're the sort of spandex racing dudes, or the families that are biking for fun and exercise, or bike commuters like myself that are using it to get from point A to point B, with the hard living members of our community where their bikes are their primary means of getting to their jobs and paying their bills and all this stuff. Can we bring all those folks together? And we did. We have a full service bike shop that sells bikes, repairs bikes, sells lights, helmets, and accessories. But it's also a social enterprise that does free repairs in the community. It's given away about 2,000 kids' bikes out in the community. And we do very intentional group rides where there is somebody on like a $6,000, lightweight racing bike that's more expensive than some people's cars, right next to somebody on a $50 Huffy bike that's kind of, and we're riding together and building those relationships. And on some level, it might seem sort of trivial, but I'll give another example of where it's really come to life. We have something called the Southside Neighborhood Leadership Academy. It's about a 9-month program where folks learn like nuts and bolts of leadership. They learn local governance, they learn grant writing. We talk a lot about asset-based community development. And they're learning the history of our community, the racial equity that has always been a struggle in our community and has sort of informed our history. And they're building relationships with each other, and they go forth and do group projects where they've come to learn that they're simply more effective when their groups have the full range of the community represented. So there was a group that wanted to help the homeless, and they had a middle-class person that could write a grant and got lots of money for it because she could do spreadsheets. But it was actually a homeless person that was also a team member in the group that informed what they were doing and said, I'm homeless, but that doesn't mean I'm living under a bridge. So I see here that you wrote this grant for like tents and sleeping bags, but I'm actually couch surfing on my friend's couch. And so that would not be helpful for me. What would actually be helpful would be like foot warmers and hand warmers, or I have a cell phone through the government, but I could really use minutes. And this group really just came alive and did tremendous work in our neighborhood because they had the full range doing it together. And then maybe the last example of this I'll give is even over the course of the studies together, they're building relationships, which again, if it just ends in like la-di-da friendship, that's good and that's fine. But when it starts to really bridge resources is when it starts to make a difference. So in this class was a blue collar guy. He was employed, but not making a lot of money. And his kid was about to graduate high school and could really use a job to help with the family income. And through this class, he met a woman who was really quite wealthy, one of the wealthiest families in our community. And her extended family owns a restaurant in the neighborhood. And he became friends with this woman, and frankly, when his son graduated, asked her if she could put in a good word and get his kid a job in the restaurant. And she picked up a phone and called and got the kid a job, and that contributed to their family income, which was all great. We could imagine a scenario where, had they not built the trust and relationship to make that ask to do that, she could have just as easily picked up the phone for her granddaughter's friend in private school that just wanted a way to fill their time in the summer, and that would have been fine. But she had social capital and social influence within her own circle that could get this job, and that went to the benefit of a guy that probably wouldn't have gotten it anyway, because they had that bridging social capital with each other. So we've started to become really intentional with any of our new entities and new ventures. How are we generating that bridging social capital so that resources are actually transferred person to person, community to community, so that we're ultimately building a mixed income, opportunity rich community where everyone can thrive and live into the full potential of what God has for them. And even just seeing a little bit of your guys' work, it sounds like even if that term third places isn't what you've used, it is a lot of what you're up to as well. I'd be curious to hear more about that.
Josiah, isn't this one of the reasons you're pushing fellowship groups? To me, that sounds like the building social relationships and.
Yeah, for sure. I think our congregation as a whole, like we've really been encouraging, just I often say like we're a church for everybody, and so we've been really trying to strive to actually be that and not just in word only. But yeah, fellowship groups would be another sort of proactive attempt to get different kinds of people in the same spaces, just to like be together and get to know each other. And when we did that a couple years ago, it was really a beautiful a beautiful thing, having, I know my group had somebody who had been in our country for about 18 months and their family, and then somebody that had been a part of our church for like 5 decades in the same space, and then a lot of different kinds of folks in between those two extremes. And again, the idea of being on even footing, and like even the space where we met kind of moved around a little bit for different people to feel more at home each time. And so that is a piece of it. I think some of what I understood Katelin to say, there are some of these spaces that are just like natural, even footing kind of spaces as well. And engaging in those spaces is important for us to know, like, where are they in Allison Hill, for instance, so that we can be there too. Think about ways we can create some as well.
I think also sometimes we have ideas and we present them and they don't go over, and that's the house is right next to the church, which is now a BHA house. Originally started as Brethren Fellowship House, which was for young women coming into the city that had jobs and needed a place to stay. And when we first presented it, we had gone over what we would do to remodel the house, everything we would do, and had figures, what it would cost and everything. And when we first presented it, the church, there were people that objected, and it was first turned down. And we had to go back to the drawing board, and we had to figure out some other things to do and present it again. And the second time we presented it, it went through. But sometimes you have to, you have to tweak things a little bit. You have to make sure things are, you have your figures that to support your work, and you've done your homework, I guess is what I'm saying is important.
Yeah, there's that, and then there's sharing the vision, and multiple times. And I've seen some times when then someone else comes up with the same idea you had, and it goes, but you've already prepared the ground for it, and who cares who it comes from when it grows.
Right.
Yeah, that's really great. That touches on, so I do a lot of sort of consulting work for churches that are just getting started in some of this stuff. I mean, you all are further along, and it's clear that you've sort of learned the same things along the way. That for us, when we're starting, we look at what we have, what has God already given us from an asset-based perspective. What are the, if we're going to start a health ministry, what do we have in health? Well, we've got, we never really had medical doctors in our congregation, but we've had nurses, and we had access to some hospitals and some things like that. But we start with what we have, and then we start, like you say, Joe, casting the vision and seeing whose eyes light up, who has the energy around similar ideas, and then we draw those folks together. And that sort of can often become a steering committee for launching what's next. And then I'm not sure if it's Donna who is just speaking, or if it's just Donna's account that we're viewing from. But yeah, then you take it to the community. Okay, thank you. Then you take it into the community, and you pray about it, and you listen to the neighborhood through those trust and relationships, whether they're built from the church or a free store or what have you. You're listening to the community and listening to God, because if it's not in line with the Holy Spirit and it's not in line with God's people, it's not going to work anyway. And then as you draw folks that have that energy around an idea, then each of them are bringing their own assets and their own opportunities, and then they're bringing their own relationships and their own partnerships. And that really is how we launched the bike shop. We saw that we had more cyclists in our community per capita than anywhere else in the city outside maybe our OSU campus, because people were using it as their primary means of transportation. And so we gathered folks around the table and we had members of our congregation that cycle every day to do their jobs and get to school. Then we did invite our partner, Nationwide Children's, to the table. We knew a realtor, and so they were at the table, and then, you know, a couple of other people. And we had members of our community that knew the safe routes to ride in our neighborhood. They knew a little bit about repairing bikes, because there's a lot of glass in our alleys, and so they knew how to change tires and could teach others those types of skills. And then if we were willing to put that up, Children's Hospital was willing to give us a little bit of seed money, because they had to demonstrate that they were doing work to reduce childhood obesity, and they had to demonstrate that was happening. And they also had a grant to give children's helmets away to the community, but they didn't have the relationships to get those out to the kids. And so we said we would give away kids helmets as part of our program, and then they could share with us some of that grant to be some of venture capital. And then the realtor had some space that he was having trouble renting out because it was just a concrete floor, and so didn't work for a restaurant or something like that. But it was perfect for a bike shop because, you know, we had like grease and mechanical stuff, and so we were able to be in that space and pay him some rent, but also have a place to put the bike shop. And so there is this energy and momentum, like you say, Gerald, to sort of casting the vision and then gathering people in the community that are interested. And then I will also just say, we as church folk sometimes cheat because we have the Holy Spirit. And so it was in that initial meeting that actually the same deaconess that helped us found First Birthdays was watching the people around the table. And there was one guy sort of sitting there like this, and he was kind of rah, 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 rah. And, you know, you're not going to get everybody. There's going to be some naysayers, and that's okay. But she had the wisdom and discernment to sort of ask him, like, you know, Ed Miner is his name. You know, if we're making like a big mistake, tell us. Like, you know, he happened to be a big time cyclist, and like, if we're doing something wrong, like, just what do you see? What are you thinking? I can see stuff going across your face. Like, share with us. And he goes, well, if you're serious about this, I'd be willing to quit my job and run it for you.
Oh.
And he's perfect. He is ordained clergy, has a background in faith-based work, but he was working with children in actually in the foster care system, really kids that just had really gone through it in life, and he understood social services, and he understood how to relate to kids from lots of different backgrounds. And he was one of these like spandex racing dudes who builds his own bikes and stuff like that. So he was perfect for the job. He became our founding executive director. He's since gone on, and we have someone else now, but it is drawing those folks with similar visions around the table that our greatest asset is our people. And then the Holy Spirit just blesses us in ways that time and again, we've been fortunate to receive, and just hope that we can keep up with what God's up to.
I think being willing to adapt and change, and a good example is what had been Brethren Fellowship House. When we remodeled that house, it was for 10 single women living in the city that either had jobs or a lot of them were going to school. And at that time, Thompson Institute and the business schools did not have dorms. And then when they began to have dorms, there wasn't really the need that there had been. And so that's when we basically repurposed it to family housing. And sometimes you have to change and repurpose things.
Absolutely. Yeah, just the critical notion, you know, God's always breathing, God's always moving, and so far be it from us not, you know, to stay stagnant in the midst of the movement of the Holy Spirit.
I particularly like the idea, or not an idea, but the statements or the programs you have dealing with infant mortality, particularly when it comes to class and race. I knew that infant mortality was a big problem in this country and amongst the groups that you mentioned, but I didn't know how severe that was until I read a book recently that was saying that infant mortality was worse now among African Americans than it was during the days of slavery. And it's documented material. The person who wrote a PhD. And so I think it's important that we realize how severe the problem is. And I also like the idea that you brought out about, I'm going to call it foundation, but the book that I was reading again calls it a theory. You know, you have a theory and then you go toward action, because a lot of times people do it the opposite way and things don't happen. And it seems like you got, of course, it's faith-based, the ABCD, which was not lost upon me. I think it's a wonderful way to approach whatever the assets, as opposed to needs, assets of the community. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much. And, you know, we've now been at this notion of first birthdays and working towards infant vitality since 2014. And so now we've got alumni that have made it through their first birthdays. And so we've had the opportunity to expand and follow those alumni 1-year-olds on into, you know, age 4 or 5 and into elementary school. We've built on that more recently, as we've noticed that the kids that do survive and thrive into their first birthdays are then arriving to kindergarten. And we've got these KSAs, or kindergarten readiness assessments, and 60% of the kids in our communities are starting kindergarten already behind in school. And those kids that start behind never catch up. And so it's our attempt at this point to expand and leverage that initial momentum to help kids be born full term, full weight, survive through their first birthday, and then thrive into kindergarten readiness. And then from there we do, I didn't touch much on this, but there's a bunch of youth development work. There's a after school program in the winter, and then something called a Freedom Schools program that we run through the summer. You all, I think, may be familiar with that model. Just a fantastic program that comes out of the Children's Defense Fund. But really, how do we work and walk alongside our kiddos and our families just through the full continuum of life, then through high school into job training and jobs in our community. And again, the dream is big, but the start is very small, but leveraging those early wins into what's next.
I had a quick question, Katelin. As you talked about assets and sort of the idea of needing to get beyond this ideology of scarcity. When I think about some of the things you've talked about with like the free store and the fresh market, for instance, a couple of those things where people just come when they want and take something. In some of the different ministries I've been involved with here on Allison Hill, there's like because of that ideology of scarcity amongst the population that are being served, sometimes there's sort of a penchant towards just taking as much as possible and almost like hoarding more than you could ever really use yourself. And so I'm wondering, like, do you just kind of like let that happen? Or is there, and how have you learned over time to help people to see, no, this, like, there's going to be more here tomorrow. Like, just take what you need and there'll be some more for you, in a few days if you need it, that kind of thing. How have you worked through some of those challenges? I imagine it's not just the Allison Hill thing. I imagine it's a scarcity ideology, just about anywhere where people are struggling. How have you dealt with some of that, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great point, Pastor, because that scarcity mentality is everywhere. I mean, Beverly Tatum at Spelman College uses a metaphor of smog to talk about racism, and it's also true with just all sorts of other sins of our world, that it's just around us. It's in the air we breathe. I mean, you look at the TV, and every commercial says, here's what's broken and missing with you, and here's a product that will fix it. And so we're all breathing this scarcity mentality, whether we're donating clothing or shopping for it. It's there, and it's something we've wrestled with. I mean, I'll be confessional, a very, very dear friend of mine, who sang in our praise team for many years with me, died very tragically in a house fire. And part of the issue with that was she could not make it to the front door, because she had a lot of stuff piled up in her house. And I've had to do some wrestling and processing around, like, I know a lot of that stuff came from the free store. And that's a tough thing. Part of it is exactly what you say, the invitation to come back tomorrow. Take what's good for you today and come back. We do put minor limits on how much you can take from the free store at any given time, but it's really only about keeping up with the shoppers and making sure we have as much on the shelves and on the racks for you to choose from if you're their very first shopper as the very last shopper. And so if we have more volunteers and we can keep the shelves stocked, there's plenty of stuff. If we can get it out on the racks quickly with lots of volunteers, we'll up those limits as much as we can. And on some level, it is just trusting people to do what's right and share with each other, and just trusting in God's economy of abundance. And for us, the free store really is rooted in a notion of grace, of God's grace. The original Greek word is charis, and it literally translated just means gift. And God doesn't limit grace and doesn't say who gets grace and who doesn't get grace. And so for us, far be it to ever make you prove your worthiness of God's grace. The fresh market's been very helpful to drive some of those notions home. Some traditional food pantries that focus on non-perishables like canned goods and cereals and that sort of thing are really great. Everyone's doing different things in the community, and we're really grateful for that. We focus on fresh fruits and vegetables, produce, and that's a good thing for health of our community. Turns out, everybody wants to eat healthy. Everybody wants to live a long life. Nobody wants to be sick. A wise person once said that, who among you would give a rock if your kid asks for bread? Turns out that guy was right one more time, and everybody wants healthy food. But access is terrible. It's expensive. And if you're walking a long way to get to the grocery store, it will always be cheaper and easier to buy a bag of potato chips than a sack of potatoes. It will always be cheaper and easier if you're taking the bus across town to buy a packet of Kool-Aid than a gallon of milk. And so what we found is, as we've offered fruits and vegetables to the community, it's exploded. It's incredibly popular. It's the #1 distributor of free food in all of Ohio, including all the food pantries that do non-perishables as well. So people want healthy food. But to your point, Pastor Josiah, that if you take and overtake, it will do what too often happens in my own refrigerator. It will spoil and go bad. And if you take too much produce, it tends to rot. And so, not unlike the manna from heaven, it becomes a really vivid lesson in don't hoard, or it will stink up your house. And so the invitation really is to come, take what's good for you and your family, take as much as you'd like, and then come back tomorrow and take more. And that's really good for us as a community. It's really good for us as a church, because it very much encourages folks to come back repeatedly so that we can build those relationships as we build the church, so that together we build the front porch of the kingdom of God. So really our model of ministry is sort of dependent on people coming back frequently and regularly, and only taking what they can use for, a couple of days at a time. And in many ways, it goes back to the original roots and history of our neighborhood that was so built on like the corner market and the mom and pop grocery store, where you sort of shopped for dinner at the end of the day and then you cooked it. And there is such beautiful community and conversation and relationship that grows out of that. Does that mean people don't just take a whole bunch of stuff? It definitely happens, and we try not to get worked up about it, and it's an ongoing journey to help our volunteers and our donors know that, okay, it's not the end of the world if that happens. There's enough. There's a more than enough.
Thank you. I wanted to be, honoring of your time. We're about to the 90-minute mark. Does anybody have one last question maybe for Dr. Hansen while she's with us? Or did you have any parting words for us, Katelin?
Well, it's just been a delight to be with you all. It's been a delight to get to know you all better. Wonderful worship service this morning, and I'm just enjoying being on the journey with like-minded folks. What a privilege to see one's story in others, and to recognize one another in the ministry. So much appreciative of you all and your work.
And we want to say thank you so much for coming and sharing. That was a wonderful sermon, and for all the exciting things that you're doing in Ohio, then in Pennsylvania. We're going to work at it.
And I had mentioned, Katelin, that we have a group of young people that are hoping to go to Cincinnati later this summer, possibly. And we definitely would try to plan to at least stop off on our way, if not make a proper long-term visit with you as part of that. So we look forward to interacting with you more in the future, certainly.
Yeah, you all would be most welcome. In fact, I unexpectedly found myself at the Underground Railroad Museum just Friday, and did think about you all, that you would make the journey. So you'd be welcome to that. I'll also say we host a conference each fall. In fact, Drew was one of our keynote speakers last year. And it really is, it's like 3 days to take a deep dive in all of this stuff. There's workshops and conversations along those lines. We are back in person this year. We're offering Zoom options for the keynote speakers, but all the workshops and that sort of thing are in person. So that's September 18th through 20th, and you'd be most welcome to that as well.
You're also welcome to stop by our church if you're ever in the Harrisburg area.
Would love to.
Yeah, we'd love to have you for sure. Okay, well, I think I'll close with a word of prayer, and then we can be on our way. God, thank you so much for today. Thank you for Dr. Hansen, who has been so generous with her time. And we just thank you for all that you're doing through the nonprofit and the church there in Columbus. And we're excited about all the different ideas that are being birthed just through this short visit. God, we pray that you be with us the rest of today. As we leave this place, we ask that you give us eyes that see the assets all around us, and no longer see the need or the deficit or the scarcity. Allow that to be energizing for us as you birth new dreams and new ideas in our hearts and in our minds about where you want us to go and what you want us to do. We just thank you again for this time, and we pray that you continue to be with us as we depart. We love you. We thank you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Katelin, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Katelin.
Thank you.
Thank you all.